Good evening. I'm Ruta Shabazi in for Marnie Hughes tonight, and we begin with images out of Ukraine that have sparked global outrage tonight. And we want to warn you, they are incredibly hard to look at, but they are important. Ukrainian forces took back cities just north of Kyiv after Russia retreated. But in one of those cities, Bucha, they found atrocities, intentional mass killings of civilians, bodies lying in the streets, some of their hands tied, many of them shot at close range. Some of the worst images we've seen in this war. And Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says he fears this is just the beginning. Tonight, there are growing calls to take action and punish Vladimir Putin for this massacre. And the U.S. and European nations are vowing to do just that. Correspondent Kelly Meyer is live in Washington tonight. And Kelly, President Biden says it's time to try Putin for war crimes.
That's right, Ruta. President Biden is calling Putin's actions brutal, again calling him a war criminal and saying what happened in Bucha, Ukraine is a war crime. He says they have to get all the details so this can be an actual war crime trial. He didn't go as far to call what happened a genocide as President Zelenskyy did today, but Russia is dismissing the West's accusation of war crimes tonight.
The world reacting to horrific new images out of Ukraine today.
This guy is brutal, and what's happening in Bucha is outrageous.
President Joe Biden calling for a war crimes trial into Russian President Vladimir Putin after his troops' withdrawal from some areas of Ukraine revealed the depths of his deadly war against the country. In Bucha, a town on the outskirts of Kyiv, streets strewn with corpses, appearing to be civilians, some with their hands tied around their backs, some children. A mass grave where the mayor says there could be up to 300 victims buried. Ukrainian President Zelenskyy leaving the capital of Kyiv for the first time since the war began to see it for himself.
We know of thousands of people killed and tortured, with severed limbs, raped women, murdered children. I think it is more than, this is a genocide.
Both Zelenskyy and Biden calling what happened in Bucha war crimes.
This warrants him, he is a war criminal. But we have to gather the information. We have to continue to provide Ukraine with the weapons they need to continue the fight. And we have to gather all the detail so this could be have a war crime trial.
Russia denying they played any part, saying it's fabricated. The Pentagon says Russia is responsible.
I think it's fairly obvious, not just to us, but to the world, that Russian forces are responsible for the atrocities in Bucha. Now, exactly who, what units, whether they're contractors or Chechens.
The Pentagon adding Russia continues to shift its focus to southern and eastern Ukraine as the U.S. and allies prepare to hit the Kremlin with new sanctions.
The Russians have now realized that the West will not break.
And President Biden calling for new sanctions against the Kremlin. Today, his national security advisor saying they'll announce those this week. Ruta Bay.
All right, Kelly, and we know there is global outrage with what Russia is doing. Any idea how other countries are reacting and could move to punish Moscow?
Well, we know the European Commission is already preparing their next sanctions package, saying they're looking at, quote, ambitious next steps. The UK says they're taking the maximum approach on sanctions, adding nothing is off the table. They also have the Metropolitan Police investigating war crimes. A big question, though, is whether the sanctions will include turning off the tap of Russian gas. The Baltic states did this weekend, but countries like Germany are on the fence. Their finance minister saying Russia's crimes could not go unanswered, but saying a full-scale embargo would hurt Germany more than Russia. Later this week, the G7 foreign ministers and NATO foreign ministers will meet, possibly announcing a tough new wave of sanctions. Ruta Bay.
All right, Kelly, thank you. And Ambassador William Courtney has decades of experience in diplomacy as a foreign service officer in the State Department, an ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia, and a special assistant to the president for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Ambassador, thanks for joining us tonight. These are just awful images. How does the international law and community define a war crime?
Well, there's no single definition of a war crime, but generally it involves something that takes place on a large enough scale where willful activities, criminal activities have taken place. The Russians, in this case, we're talking about maybe a couple hundred folks who were killed in Bucha. As Russian forces pull out of other parts of northern Ukraine, which they seem to be doing now, it's possible that other incidents or massacres can be found. So as President Biden rightly said today, it's important to gather more evidence.
So who would be in charge of investigating and prosecuting Putin and whoever carried out these crimes directly, and what would that look like?
Well, that could depend. So the International Criminal Court is already carrying out an investigation. It is possible that a special international tribunal could be set up. That was the case for former Yugoslavia, but decisions on that sort of thing haven't been made yet. Russia is not a party to the International Criminal Court, neither is the United States. Many European countries are.
Right. And so because of that, that's a little bit, leaves a lot of questions, right? Like, how realistic is it that Putin will face any real consequences? We think of the former Yugoslavia and how many years it took to track down those criminals after they were convicted.
It could take some time. Of course, much will depend on the outcome of the current conflict and what happens to current leadership in the Kremlin. If there is, for example, regime change, would the new leadership be willing to give up to an international tribunal leaders from the current regime? Those things are all uncertainties at this point.
So what about the evidence? Because it seems to me like we're looking at it every day on our air, but it's not that simple. It's still necessary, right, to send investigators in real time, even though we have these images, these pictures, this video, these social media posts everywhere, right?
Yes, and courts generally like to have as much ironclad evidence as possible. So doing this carefully and deliberately is a process that will actually enhance the credibility of whatever decision may be made by an international court.
So if a war crimes investigation is initiated, as you say it has been, how would you expect the Kremlin to respond? The Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov issued a statement saying, quote, "Not a single civilian has faced any violent action by the Russian military."
So as you point out, Sergei Lavrov's comment suggests that the Kremlin would be strongly opposed to any international criminal investigation which might implicate Russian forces. As I mentioned, the International Criminal Court is not adhered to by Russia. So there could be various legal as well as political issues involved before determinations are made whether a case will go before an international tribunal.
And also jurisdictional issues, right? Since they are not a party to this entity. I mean, let's say the International Criminal Court was successful, or a tribunal was successful in proving war crimes against Putin and Russia. Can't he just evade these consequences, to my earlier point, by staying in Russia if there's no regime change?
If the Russian government decides to protect leaders in Russia who are convicted of international tribunals of war crimes, then of course the reach of the tribunal would not be sufficient to detain those folks.
All right, Ambassador Courtney, thank you. You have so much experience. We appreciate hearing from you tonight.
Thanks for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.